Greetings all. This will be the first recorded lecture for this course, EDCO 593, Historical Development of School Counseling and School Psychology. This is a week 3 lecture and presentation as indicated. It will be inclusive of chapters 1 through 4, but I'll focus mainly on chapters 2 through 4 in this presentation because we've pretty much discussed and determined that chapter 1 is one that it's an overview, just as it's indicated. It's an introduction to all of these topics. So to go over that would be overkill. So we know that chapter 1 was read and sets the tone as far as the historical portion of this course. Here we see a timeline, and this is kind of a preview of a lot of things that will be discussed, just as the documents that were provided last week. If it wasn't mentioned, this is not a linear history type of class, at least not yet. It won't be that until we get to more modern times. I would say pre-civil rights, and then from there we can go in a more sequential manner. But as of now, it's a little bit more all over the place because of, again, the context that it's trying to set. All of it takes a historical spin. It's just, again, not one of those things to where it starts from point A and then sequentially makes its way to where we'll end up. It's a bit scattered, and that's okay. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a couple of slides from now. But the nature of education and the theory and key figures and all of those sorts of things, just like with psychology, just like with sociology, just like with philosophy, how there's different themes, different theories, different individuals, and they can sometimes supplement a previous theory, or they can go totally against a previous theory and present a new one, or there can be something else that comes in and it's sort of a hybrid. The same thing can be said as far as education is concerned. So again, for the first few weeks, it will be a conversation that's, in terms of the era and time, all over the place. The timeline breakdown just throws out some general ideas and concepts, some general eras. Those will become important. Not so much for you to memorize. None of this is with the intent of you memorizing historical facts and dates and times and things of that nature. It's not that. It's more about, again, setting the context of things and being able to understand how we've come to where we are in relation to the field of school counseling and school psychology as it lies within the field of education. So you'll see some images, you'll see mention of the textbook itself, you'll see different reiterations. We're on the 10th edition, so obviously this is a textbook that has been around for a little while, and in some instances it shows. But again, the images that you see in front of us are the picture, figuratively and literally, of education. And if you take a look at those images, you can get an idea of in its inception, who was benefiting the most from education in the United States. So we'll move forward. As I stated, chapter 1 was an introduction, great introduction, applying history to education today. I stated that it provides a foundation and context of how education and schooling has changed universally over time. It examines the roots and origins of systems and institutions, and it indicates the level of exclusiveness and the lack of access in some instances that the institution of education has from a historical perspective. I'll speak quickly because I don't want this file to be too big because it becomes a problem uploading it. So I apologize in advance if I am speaking fast, but I've provided the uninterrupted version of this presentation, PowerPoint, for you to look at on your own. So you can use it in a variety of ways. You can take this, for what it's worth in what I'm saying, and then go back to that one if necessary and go at your own pace and kind of rethink of some of the things that are mentioned as I'm doing this quote unquote lecture. Chapter 2 talks about shaping the school's philosophical and psychological foundations. I think it provided a great timeline. Again, you can visually see that although it is a timeline, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's sequential or in order. And this paragraph that comes straight from the textbook kind of sums it up very well. It says, no neat and tiny boxes, neither education, philosophy, or philosophy itself divides automatically into neat categories. The discrete schools, or isms as they are often called, have no validity apart from the thinkers whose systems of thought they represent. So we'll talk about the isms in just a second, but as you can see, it goes back to the Aristotles and the Platos, and then it will throw in a John Locke, and it'll throw in a John Dewey, and then it'll have reference to even some psychologists, B.F. Skinner, or people of that nature, that you'll see where it overlaps between all of the quote-unquote sciences or studies or fields in which as humans, as educators and those that have become educated have studied, again, from the beginning of history up till where we are with a particular focus on education. Here's an example of some key figures and the isms, as we'll refer to them. That's perennialism, idealism, realism, pragmatism, reconstructionism, and protest philosophy, or behavioralism, existentialism, or postmodernism. Those last three specifically are identical to the ideas, concepts, and theories of psychologists because they were developed by psychologists. So if they sound familiar, it's because they are. So you can see here the educational philosophy, the influences or the individuals who developed these philosophies. You'll see the rationale, and you'll see the curriculum as far as the types of things that were used to convey ideas, concept, and in a sense, the education portion of it all. So I'm not going to sit here and reread this for you. You take some time and you can read them on your own, just paying a particular attention to the rationale of each ism. So you can see that there's differences as it relates to the isms. The images that you see, again, depict the individuals who are responsible for these schools of thought, no pun intended, these theories or educational philosophies as they are referred to. So as we speak of the isms, these are the philosophies in which they're referring to. We'll continue. Going further with the isms, you'll see the role of the teacher. That becomes important because you'll see it evolve in some instances, or you'll see the mindset of individuals when they come from these particular educational philosophies or isms, and how they portray themselves in some instances or teach in effect. They're in some instances a heavy emphasis on lectures and discussions. You'll see some that are more interactive. You'll see the examination types or the way in which the educator checks for students' understanding. And so this is, again, a table that illustrates the different teacher or methods and examinations as it relates to each particular ism. Then you'll see the outcome, the intended outcome of the isms. You'll see the preferred architecture. You'll see the criticism from others as it relates to these respective isms or educational philosophies. And you'll see what the intended outcome. You'll see that for some, the intended outcome was the production of intellectual scholars. You'll see for others uh, technician scientist or problem solvers is what the goal is. You'll see for a particular school of thought that the outcome is social activists. When I teach this class in person, there's a heavy emphasis on Reconstructionism and the era in which that lies in. And first thing that comes to mind to me was the hippie era or the civil rights movement era, and the fact that a lot of those movements or social rebellions stem from students, and those students were products of their teachers who, by most accounts, were from the ism or the educational philosophy of Reconstructionism. So again, you'll see the relationship between certain eras, certain social movements, certain things that were happening in society. And just as I've stated, I don't know if I've stated it to you guys, but what happens in schools are a microcosm of what happens in society. Schools are a microcosm of society. And so what I mean by that is you can't separate the two. You can't take what's happening in society and not expect it to have some implications as far as what's going on in schools, and vice versa. You can't separate what's happening in schools and not expect it to have some implications as it relates to what goes on in society. Ultimately, the mission of today's schools are to cultivate critical thinkers who become productive contributors and members of society. So there's always going to be a relationship between school and society. And as we talk about the historical development of educational institutions, you'll realize that part of the reasoning behind the public school was to improve the conditions of the average person in society. We'll speak about this gentleman a bit more in depth as we move forward, but he's one of my favorite figures, and this is not an attempt to sway you to do any research or write your paper on him, but he is going to be an important figure as we discuss John Dewey. And just reading the first couple of sentences from this excerpt from the book, it says, by any measure, John Dewey was the most important educational philosopher ever produced in the United States, as well as a major founder of pragmatism. He talks about his birth, talks about his Puritan values in Protestant Christianity. We'll talk about Puritans later on in this and their profound effect on the educational system in the United States. But what's ironic, and as I stated, we'll talk more about Dewey, but what's ironic about Dewey is he was not embraced during his time. And I'll explain what's meant by that as we proceed in these next few weeks. Would definitely be embraced in today's climates because of his stance on taking a holistic approach, his stance on looking at personal interest and passions, and how that should be a, for lack of a better term, vehicle to help improve individuals' education ability. Um, yeah, but ironically, as stated, he wasn't viewed as this valuable contributor as he should have been or could have been during the time in which he was alive. So we'll talk about Dewey for the next couple of weeks and make references to him for the remaining weeks of this course. I asked the question, what is philosophy? I asked, what is psychology? And you can see just a very generic Google response as to what those things are. But in the in-person class, my question behind the question of what are these sciences is, when did they become a thing? Philosophy dates back to your Aristotles, your Plato's. Like, those are the ultimate philosophers. And when they were educating, it was the community of select few that they worked with, and they hoped to develop more thinkers. You see the images of the famous statue, the thinker. That was their goal, to develop more intellectuals such as themselves. When you fast forward to the 17th, 18th, 19th century, and this thing called psychology developed. What's important to realize is over time, society's changed, and obviously the study of, I can throw sociology in here, I can throw political science in here, I can throw history in here. Things have evolved as we as humans have evolved. And so again, chapter 2 focuses on the connection between philosophy and psychology and their relationship to education. I just definitely wanted to take my time to go through these things and not go too heavy, but I didn't want to not mention this as it relates to chapter 2. Although I told you to read over it, I still definitely wanted to discuss these things so that you understood the connection. And for some of you, this may be where you want to focus as you do your paper. So for some of you, if this is the most interesting component, feel free to talk a bit more about the relationship of these particular sciences or fields of study. I think that's a better term, fields of study, as they overlap, supplement, and correspond and correlate and all the things as it relates to education. Chapter 3. Chapter 3 talks about European heritage and the colonial influence. So you'll see from the 1600s all the way up to the late 1700s, the influence that Europe had on what happened in what would soon become the United States. That's a piece of the puzzle that we'll talk about in just a second. But again, I think it's important to not overlook some of these things that the timeline depicts. Harvard, founded in 1636, as a direct result of what was happening in the mother country of Europe, in Oxford and Cambridge. Those that came to the new country, in a lot of instances, wanted to emulate and imitate what was happening in the old country. And so Harvard was one of those things that they wanted to duplicate and be just like what was happening over there. Now, there were a few other considerations that changed the trajectory. Religion played a big role. Politics played a big role. And just the climate and the way the things evolved that eventually separated the United States from the mother country or countries, that definitely impacted the way education went. There's certain things that we still do. We did the discussion post on tradition and history as far as graduation is concerned. That dates back to the 12th and 13th century in Europe. I don't want to steal anyone's thunder, but definitely, please, if you haven't already contributed to that discussion, please make sure you do so. One thing that stands out to me, there's a few things that do, but before I switch over to the next slide, the 1647 Old Deluder Satan Act. You're unfamiliar with it? Google it or read in the book about it. I think that'll be helpful for some of you as you're looking for ways to connect religion and education. That's a perfect example of how religion has always played a role until contemporary times as it relates to education. Southern colonies. So if you, again, haven't read the chapter, there's some things that I want you to be certain of. Tutorial schools, old field schools, dame schools, and what secondary and higher education looked like specifically in the southern colonies. It's different than what was happening in the middle colonies or the New England colonies. So again, look at it, but don't go too heavy, don't go too deep. That's not what I'm asking you to do. Just look at the types of things that existed at that particular time and the distinguishing characteristics of what went on in particular colonies as it relates to the original 13. The middle colonies: New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland. Again, here's some characteristics. Some things that I want you to be aware of are the academies in the middle colonies, Latin grammar schools in the middle colonies, common schools, higher education, specifically in the middle colonies. There were some differences between what was happening in the middle colonies versus what was happening in the southern colonies. So again, I just want you to get a context of what those things were. Says that education was diverse. Schools were often run by local churches or religious groups in the middle colonies. So, yeah, make sure you take some notes as to what was happening in the middle colonies as it relates to education in the colonial periods. Let's take a look at New England, the New England colonies. It says the New England colonies had the characteristics of religious freedom, strong towns and communities, Puritan influence. The economy played a role, as well as the geography played a role. Puritans. Let's take a look at some of the values and beliefs as far as the Puritan is concerned. Again, I'm not going to read these to you or for you, but they're there. What I will read, though, is from the historical perspective. It says that educators need to understand the historical link with the colonial past. Although Puritan heritage can be overemphasized, its contributions are important in understanding the present culture and preparing for a viable future. Beliefs of early settlers in colonial New England still cast a shadow over modern values or values in modern American society. Those who do not appreciate this historical fact are ill prepared to understand the value conflicts that are central to so many modern educational issues. I think that the author of this textbook has a tendency to be biased, and sometimes it shows more than others. But this is something that is very important. The Puritan influence on, again, what would eventually become the American school system. So we'll talk about Puritans, we'll talk about Quakers, we'll talk about the differences between the two, and again, how they influenced what would be the American educational system. Chapter 4 specifically talks about American education during the Revolution. So what stands out and becomes important as far as this chapter is concerned is here's where the separation starts. Here's where, just as stated, we become an independent nation. This is where we are forming our own identities. This is where we are trying to, as a nation, form our own culture. But there's some uniqueness that exists here in this land. And one of those biggest issues is what allowed this nation to become as prosperous as it did. I'm speaking of the free labor. I'm speaking of the institution of slavery. I'm speaking of westward expansion and what happened when we spread as a nation from just being in those 13 colonies to the Louisiana Purchase to moving beyond and westward. Those are all things that will need to be considered, not this week, but in these next few weeks, because that has a profound impact on what was to come. And I think that sometimes those issues are overlooked. It can't just be, oh, the 13 colonies, we expanded and everything was great. No, we're talking generations of other individuals that, for one, weren't included in this development of documents, the Constitution, all of these things, Bill of Rights. They didn't have certain segments in mind when these things were developed. So we're not going to not talk about those things as it relates to education, because those things definitely play a role in the development of the educational systems. Yeah, so we'll get to that. But these are the things that led up to that evolutionary change as far as education is concerned. Here's John Locke's influence. I'm not going to read it. I see this is turning into a lengthy presentation, and I don't want that for the sake of uploads. But here's a paragraph that I want you to read through. The liberalism in certain colonies. This is the Quaker influence. And as you look at these photos and these images, you notice a difference than the images from a few slides ago. Quakers played a big role in educational access to others. They also played a big role into religious freedom as far as education is concerned. So yeah, we'll spend some time next week talking about Quakers, which really isn't the most appropriate term for them, but we'll talk about that next week. So that's that. Later changes. It talks about Harvard, Yale, William and Mary, different colleges that were formed. Again, right up before and up until and through the American Revolutionary period. We look at the fact that certain individuals, in fact, wanted a national university system dating back as far as the 1700s. There were proposals for departments of education dating back as early as the 1700s. We'll speak to those things a bit more in detail, especially because of how controversial that topic is, like literally on a day-to-day basis. So we'll get a better understanding of how those institutions or departments came into being and what their true intent is, or for some, they may view it as what their intent was in current times. Noah Webster, I'm sure we've all heard of Webster's Dictionary. He was known as the schoolmaster to America. So you'll be exposed to him as far as the chapters are concerned. And as I said, for some of you, that might be one of your key figures that you want to do a bit more research on. National system fails to win approval. So there were those that were proponents of higher education dating back to the 1770s. And there were those that had more influence in saying, nah, that's not what we're going to do. And again, we'll talk more specifically about the direction that things ended up taking. But I just wanted you to be aware of the fact that this was something that was on certain people's radar. The fact that public education was to be accessible to all members of society was a thought for some. The thought that everyone can benefit from education, primary, secondary, higher ed, was a thought once upon a time. And again, we'll look at how things evolved and who, quote unquote, won in terms of the direction that the educational system ended up going. So those will be topics of conversation. Local power versus state power, local power versus federal control, federal education acts. All things that were politically charged throughout history. And I've said this in my in-person course, these are things that are relevant to today. So here's where I want to focus. Not this specifically, but the fact that there are a lot of people that feel as though the political climate as it relates to education is something that's brand new. No, there's always been a relationship with politics, controversy, and education. that this is nothing new. What we're experiencing, like literally on a daily basis today, is not new. But we'll talk more about it as we move through the remainder of this course. That's what we're going to zero in on. Not, again, what was happening in the 1700s, but what started then and bring it up to where we are today. Formation of the U.S. Department of Education. The 1776 report. Some of you may be aware of what that is in today's terminology. If you're not familiar with that, please take a moment to do a quick internet search of what the 1776 report is. Not saying agree or disagree or whatever the case may be, but just get to know what that is in today's times. But again, the formation of the U.S. Department of Education goes back to the 1800s. The disapproval of some of what that department should or could be goes back to the 1700s. So we'll talk about those things and move forward and connect some of the dots as far as the past and the present. Yeah, 31 minutes, mission accomplished. I think we're good for now. I'll see you guys on the other side.